Just some housekeeping first. As you know, if you're a regular viewer, our telephone system was brought down during the last show. It was part of a global breakdown of the global telephone company which we use and pay good money to. The global telephone company was down for 2 hours and 10 minutes, and our show lasted for 2 hours and 9 minutes. So you didn't have to be Sherlock Holmes in order to work out what had happened. The telephone company refused to confirm or deny that they had been hacked, in which case we have now reported the matter to the police because it is a serious criminal offence to interrupt someone's communications, especially something that has an audience of 1 million viewers. As I can proudly announce to you, we have again this week. More than 1 million viewers are not going to be interrupted by hooligan hackers. And if we are, we demand the protection of Her Majesty's Constabulary. Mind you, there have still been no arrests of the man who sent an email in the early hours of the morning last week threatening to bomb the show, to blow it up with a bomb, and if the bomb failed, to knife me himself. This despite the fact that the man helpfully left his name and his photograph and the link to his blogspot on the threatening email. There's been a lot of police activity taking statements about when and where the email was received and by whom and who was told when about it, but the man, so far as I know, is still at large. Now, if I had been any political leader other than myself, and if this man had, say, been a Muslim, he would already be behind bars. His door would have been kicked in hours after the threatening mail was sent, but none of that has happened, which is buttressing my already inclination that it is now becoming impossible to work and operate in a free and democratic way in this country of Great Britain. We are being shadow banned, we are being strangled, we are being censored, we are being denied platforms, and now our show is being interrupted by hackers. We are being threatened with death in the most condign circumstances, and nobody yet has been arrested. So I'm drawing the appropriate conclusions and will keep you posted in due course. But there's much, much bigger things happening today. I know Seymour Hersh well. He arranged, when I lived in Battersea Rise in London, for several pages of a chapter of one of his books to be put through my letterbox, through my door, late on a Saturday evening. The pages concerned Robert Maxwell and his gun running and espionage activities. I presume that Seymour Hersh, whom at that stage I had never met, was intending that I would use my then privileged position as a Member of Parliament to highlight the allegations made in the chapter, which were, on the face of it, extreme, even outlandish. But no journal was able to publish these allegations by Seymour Hersh, then as now, the United States' preeminent investigative journalist, because Robert Maxwell had taken indictments, pre-publication indictments, against every newspaper, against every publisher, even against every bookshop, to ensure that Seymour Hersh would not be able to be heard. So I was proud to table a motion on that Monday morning in the House of Commons, which meant that every newspaper in the land could publish those allegations without fear of being sued by Maxwell. That which seemed extreme, even outlandish, before my tabling of the parliamentary motion quickly proved to be true and indeed only part of the truth. Robert Maxwell was revealed within a couple of weeks of that date as the biggest thief of the 20th century, stealing hundreds of millions of pounds from his own employees' pension funds. And all the allegations about gun running and about espionage on behalf of Israel turned out to be spectacularly true. So true that Robert Maxwell then fell off the end of the boat. Or was he pushed? Perhaps we'll never know, but he either jumped or was pushed precisely because of the allegations unearthed by Seymour Hersh. And therefore, ever since, and that's more than 30 years, I guess, now, I have always looked forward to the publication of the latest investigation by Seymour Hersh, and today it came. On his Substack, in a lengthy piece, he establishes beyond contradiction that the United States and its ally, Great Britain, blew up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which I described at the time as the greatest act of international terrorism since 9/11, and indeed just as far-reaching in its consequences. It's true that 3,000 people didn't die in the blowing up of the Nord Stream, but far more than 3,000 have died, will die, as a result of the interruption to and the superinflation of energy prices caused directly by that act of terrorism. The international situation became even more grave as a result of that act of international terrorism. And so it is possible to say that the act of terrorism that Hersh reveals in his piece today is every bit as serious as the terrorist attack on the Twin Towers and elsewhere in the United States on 9/11, 2001. That's a big claim that is absolutely substantively established by Seymour Hersh's article today. Now, Joe Biden has denied it, calling it a work of complete fiction. So it's up to you. Who do you believe? Joe Biden or the world's greatest investigative journalist, Seymour Hersh? Perhaps you should take a read of Hersh's piece before making your judgment. But if you believe Joe Biden, as I always say, I still have a bridge here in London that I could sell you going cheap. Now, as I say, I'm old enough to have been demonstrating outside the Houses of Parliament when a B-movie actor appeared before both houses in Westminster Hall, but it was nothing like the slut show that took place today at Westminster. The cross-dressing porn actor Volodymyr Zelensky, turned president of Ukraine, was, well, basically greeted by people lying on their back with their legs open. They definitely were asking for it. They were asking to be humiliated still further. They were asking to be robbed still further. And they were asking to be dragged into what will become World War III and the end of humanity as we know it. Macaulay, I think, talked about no sight more ridiculous than the British people in a fit of morality. That was demonstrated, at least within the Beltway, at least within the Westminster bubble today. It was a scene of mass hysteria. Not quite mass, there's only a few hundreds of them, but amongst that few hundreds, there was unanimity. There was unanimity that this man is the second coming. That this man is, as Andrew Marr, the erstwhile Trotskyite and Scottish nationalist turned fundament-licking right-wing neoliberal, described as the equivalent of Nelson Mandela. Andrew Marr, if you cast your mind back to what you were back then, Zelensky is no Nelson Mandela. I knew Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela was a friend of mine. Zelensky is no Nelson Mandela. For a start, Nelson Mandela never put on a basque, suspenders, stockings and women's underwear, and cavorted on television for a living. Nelson Mandela was never feted by all the chancelleries of Europe and the kings and presidents of the so-called Western world, at least not until he'd served 28 years of penal servitude, most of it on a rock called Robben Island. Mandela had no support from Western governments. The Western governments conspired and collaborated with those who imprisoned Nelson Mandela and tens of millions of Africans in apartheid South Africa. The West supported apartheid South Africa until it literally collapsed. The West was still supporting apartheid South Africa even when the apartheid leaders had decided that the game was up and a settlement with Mandela in Pollsmoor Hospital would have to be negotiated. The West opposed Nelson Mandela and his African National Congress. I know because I was there. I was underground in apartheid South Africa on behalf of the African National Congress. I gave some of my blood on the floor of the Gugulethu police station in apartheid South Africa. And of course, many thousands of the brave fighters of the ANC, of the freedom movement, of Mkonte and Sizwe, the spear of the nation, gave their life, not the blood from their nose. And tens of thousands gave hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years put together in incarceration in the dungeons of apartheid. There was one country, however, in the whole world that was supporting Nelson Mandela. When America and Britain and France and Germany and all the others were supporting the Boers in the apartheid system, there was one country, at least, that was supporting Nelson Mandela, who was compared to Zelensky today. I'll leave you to work out what that one country was. But as I say, you don't have to be Sherlock Holmes to actually work it out. You don't have to work out who gave MK their weapons, who gave MK their uniforms, who gave them their rations, who flew them around the world, who maintained the base camp of the anti-apartheid liberation movement in Lusaka and elsewhere, who supported the freedom struggle in South Africa, in the United Nations, in every international fora, in the teeth of the opposition and hatred of every Western government. I myself sat in Parliament and saw Margaret Thatcher's lips move as she described Nelson Mandela, and I quote, as nothing more than a common terrorist. So don't dare compare this strutting pawn actor Zelensky to the great Nelson Mandela. We'll be talking about the war and how badly it's going. I'll be talking about it tomorrow night at the Oxford Union when I debate Ben Wallace, the Secretary of State for Defence, and his aide-de-camp, the head of the British Army. 2-1 is decent odds, don't you think? I'm bringing my short sword. Ben, you better bring your tin hat, because I have plenty of ammunition to say to you. And lastly, on the subject of the balloon. It's difficult to credit how many apparently sane people in the United States of America fell for the great balloon hoax. You can understand how the Republicans wanted to embarrass Joe Biden about the fact that a Chinese weather balloon was able to cross the entire subcontinental North America without being shot down. You can understand the Republicans until you know that the same weather balloon did exactly the same thing twice under the presidency of Donald Trump. You can understand Joe Biden's apparent ire at discovering that this happened on his watch, except it's the second time that it has happened on Joe Biden's watch. You could be forgiven for thinking that China had not informed the United States that their weather balloon had gone off course as a result of very unexpected crosswinds. But it turns out that China was in constant contact with the United States government on the exact position and purpose of this weather balloon. You'd be forgiven for thinking that China had committed some kind of unique or unprecedented offense until you discover that the United States has an entire fleet of these surveillance balloons flying over Russia, flying over China, flying over India, flying over anywhere that the United States wants to fly them. And yet, the newspapers duly rolled over, the television news broadcasts went haywire, went into hysterics about a common or garden balloon. A Top Gun in an F-16 was sent by Joe Biden to bring this balloon down. He did, at the third attempt, firing 3 Sidewinder missiles when he could have leant out of the cockpit with a drawing pin. At $400,000 per missile, $1.2 million worth of missile was used to bring down a $5,000 weather balloon. The world has gone crazy, but not here on the mother of all talk shows. Lean in for this detail. In the last 7 days, more than 1 million people have watched this show. Thank you for being amongst them. Fasten your seatbelts. We've got 2.5 hours more of this, the mother of all talk shows.